So I'm Leanne Jackson. I'm the head of the Agri-Food Trade and Markets Division in OECD, and it's in that directorate where the report "Making Better Policies for Food Systems" was produced, and we'll be talking a bit about that later. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. A bit about myself, if you don't know me, I joined the OECD last year in January after spending about 16 years at the WTO, where I worked on agricultural trade in all its many forms, including SPS issues, the agricultural negotiations, and the regular work of the Committee on Agriculture. At the Agri-Food Trade and Markets team, I lead a group that produced this food systems report. We also do collaboration with FAO on the annual Outlook publication, and we have some work on standard setting in seeds, tractors, and fruits and vegetables. So we're really excited about this webinar, which we're going to dig into a bit more on national food strategies. In the lead up to the pre-summit, which will be in the middle of July, and the actual UN Food Systems Summit, which will be later in September, conversations are now focusing on identifying some game-changing solutions and collective areas for action for food systems. Elements identified and agreed on will then have to be implemented by countries. So OECD's contribution to the Food Systems Summit, as we see it, is to use our convening power to really zero in on how food systems policies can be designed and implemented. So again, for those of you that are joining us just now, we are recording today's webinar. In order to make sure we have an interesting exchange during the second half of the session, I encourage you to send your questions in through the chat function. So with no more delay, I'll turn over to my colleague Koen de Koninck, who's an economist in my team, who is the lead author of the report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems, which was published earlier this year. And he also authored a report on concentration in seed markets, which was published in 2018. Before coming to the OECD, he was a management consultant with Bain and Company. Koen will be presenting a quick overview on achieving better policies for food systems, navigating facts, interests, and values. And I'll hand over the floor to Koen right now.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you everybody for joining us for this how-to webinar on national food strategies. Meanwhile, trying to share my screen, so let's hope this all works well. I think many of the people here today have already joined us for a previous webinar, and that means that you've already heard me give the presentation summarizing this report. So I will not be doing that. I will very briefly explain why exactly we are here and how it ties to the topics we cover in the report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems, which came out in January of this year. If you would like a longer version and you had missed it previously, just feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to give you a summary of the report. In a nutshell, our report deals with three big questions around food systems. The first question we look at is, what are the challenges and achievements of food systems and what is the role of policies? The second big question we're looking at is, we know that food systems are complex. The term food systems describes these interlinkages between agriculture, food security, nutrition, the environment. And so these interlinkages between health, nutrition, agriculture, that is at the core of food systems. And at the same time, that means that intrinsically it's a complex web of interactions. So it's not obvious how you have to navigate that to come up with coherent policies. And a third set of questions have to do with various obstacles we face when we're trying to make better policies for food systems. And this corresponds to the three core chapters of our report. And you'll notice that 2 out of the 3 chapters are explicitly about the how to develop better policies. And that is not a coincidence. Some of the discussion in food systems tends to immediately jump to this question of what is the better policy? What is the optimal recommendation in this or that context? Which is important work as well, and we also do some of that. But at the same time, food systems are incredibly complex, and it's not clear that you can come up with a one-size-fits-all recommendation. All of these policies will need to be tailored to local circumstances. So it's also important that we think about a good process so that we can come up with locally adapted policies. And one thing that makes it complicated is that we are expecting many different things from food systems, what we are calling a triple challenge. We expect food security and nutrition for a growing population. We expect that food systems contribute to livelihoods for farmers, for fishermen, for many other people involved in food systems. We also expect food systems to do their part to improve environmental sustainability. And in addition, we also want resilience across these dimensions. So the list of demands on the food system is quite long. And in our first chapter, we show that performance of the food systems on these dimensions has not been black and white, and better policies can make a difference, and work by the OECD and others has identified many areas for improvement. But still, we have to keep in mind that it is a tall order to achieve all of these things at once. And to further complicate that, food systems are, as I mentioned before, by definition, a complex web of interactions. So that means that it's not at all obvious whether an initiative to improve something in one domain will not accidentally make things worse in another area. And this gets to the heart of policy coherence. How can we make sure that an initiative in one area will not accidentally make things worse in another area? Or ideally, that it will actually help us to achieve co-benefits, that it will simultaneously help us achieve goals in other domains. And in addition to those complications, there are other obstacles in the form of disagreements over facts, interests, and values. There's a lot we know about food systems, but there's also a lot we do not know. There is sometimes a lack of data or evidence about problems, about their causes, about how different policies would affect that. Sometimes there are gaps between perception and the evidence. So it's important that you get to a shared understanding of the facts. At the same time, facts can tell you how the world is. It doesn't tell you how the world should be. So inevitably, interests and values come into play as well. And whenever there's a change in policy, there will be winners and losers. So of course, different groups have an incentive to try and influence the policy process and move it in their preferred direction. So it's also important that any policy process promotes transparency, accountability, and the level playing field. And while facts and interests are often discussed in the context of food systems, there's a third component here, values, which is not often, has not often received as much attention as it should. Many of the issues we talk about when we talk about food systems have a very strong ethical component to it. And a lot of the disagreements and controversies have a large value dimension to it. For example, a debate on genetically modified organisms is ostensibly about benefits and risks of a new technology. In reality, there are many other things happening as well. Some people don't trust large corporations. Other people simply think it is unethical to be playing with genetics like that. So managing these disagreements over facts, interests, and values is part of why it is so difficult to create better policies for food systems. And in the OECD, we have a lot of expertise on the what, on the facts. What are the policies today? What are the policy problems today? What are different countries doing? But we also know that because it is so important that we make every policy for food system adapted to local circumstances, we also felt that it was important to share these insights on how to make better policies for food systems. Hence these webinars where we dig in a little bit deeper on the how-to aspects. This is not the first how-to webinar. We've had two before. We had one where we explored the use of deliberative processes to make progress on controversial issues, for example, on contentious values controversies. We also had another webinar where we explored the use of regulatory impact assessments as a tool to make sure that a new policy initiative, to improve policy coherence, essentially, to make sure that we think through possible effects of a new initiative on a range of different outcomes. And so today we'll have a third discussion on making national food strategies. And we'll hear directly from practitioners who have been doing that or who are in the process of doing that. So I just want to finish by highlighting the expertise that the OECD has on food systems. As you probably know, we work on a range of different topics on food systems, whether it's poverty, obesity, rural well-being, land use, responsible supply chains, and many more. And much of these insights have been synthesized in our report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems. We also have a portal page there, which links directly to all relevant work by the OECD on food systems. And of course, if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact us at the email address shown here. And with that, I'll give the floor back to you, Liane.
Great, thank you so much, Koen. So now that we've heard from OECD, let's hear from two experienced policymakers. So we're really delighted today to be joined from Ottawa, Canada by Jason Baillargeon and from London by Dustin Benton. The way the next part of the webinar will unfold is we have each of our experts have about 15 minutes to share with us their thoughts and experiences. And then we'll have a question and answer. And again, you can use the chat function to send in your questions. At the end, I may jump in if we're going a bit beyond 15 minutes speakers. So I'll give you a gentle reminder at 15 minutes to give you a sense of when to wrap up. So just a little bit about Jason, who will be our first speaker. Jason will share with us about how to design, he's going to share with us about the design and implementation of the food policy for Canada. Jason was appointed Director of Food Policy at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in September of 2018. Canada's first ever food policy was launched in June 2019, building on extensive engagement across Canada. His current focus is on implementing Canada's food policy, which includes adopting a food systems-based approach and enhancing coordination among food-related policies and programs, as well as bringing diverse food systems partners and stakeholders together. So I'll hand the floor over to you, Jason. You have 15 minutes. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Leanne. And thank you, Koen, for setting the stage. And thank you to the OECD for the important work in this area as we collectively work to improve food-related outcomes. So maybe to start by saying, I don't think there's a defined blueprint, and it's important to consider the unique context in which we operate and live. As such, there are a number of approaches to developing food policies. With that in mind, I'll share today the Canadian approach and experience, as well as a few things that I think were important in successfully launching the policy and as well as its early implementation. To the next slide. So context matters, and I could probably spend a considerable amount of time on the Canadian context, but I'll limit myself to a few points for consideration. Canada has an abundant supply of agricultural resources, favorable climatic and natural growing conditions, world-class regulations and food safety systems, leading-edge technology, and a dedicated sector committed to producing high-quality food. Most people in Canada enjoy access to a wide variety of healthy, affordable, domestic and imported food, and Canadians typically allocate a smaller portion of their income to food than residents of other countries. All levels of government in Canada have made investments that directly or indirectly support Canada's food systems to help address food-related issues. Now, despite the wide range of investments, shortcomings exist in Canada's food systems related to food security, healthy eating, environmental sustainability, and the prosperity of Canada's food and agriculture sector. The prevalence of food insecurity is greater in isolated northern communities, Indigenous, female lone parent, and Black households. Our Minister, the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food supplementary mandate letter of January 2021 included a commitment to address food insecurity in Canada, including through working directly with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation partners in the co-development programs. Go to the next slide. So here we have it. This is the 2015 mandate letter from the Prime Minister to our Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food with a commitment to develop a food policy that promotes healthy living and safe food by putting more healthy, high quality food produced by Canadian ranchers and farmers on the tables of families across the country. So this was the starting point in terms of our work within the department to develop the policy. Go to the next slide. We could see here that, just to note, and there's links to each of these, but prior to the mandate letter, it's important to recognize that industry and civil society stakeholders, as well as academia and others, had called for the government to develop a food policy for quite some time that enables greater policy coherence and a coordinated approach across government and food system actors, as well as to address shortcomings in our food systems. Go to the next slide. So this gives you a sense of the consultations that were undertaken. They began in 2017. You'll note that engagement sessions were led from national through to community levels with leadership from a wide range of actors, including members of parliament and civil society. I would like to note that in addition to input gathered from Indigenous individuals and organizations through the online survey, national and regional engagement sessions, and civil society engagement, the government also engaged bilaterally with national Indigenous organizations to identify preferred approaches for Indigenous engagement on the development of the food policy. While the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples invited government officials to engage at its annual General Assembly that September, the Inuit Tabarit Kanatami, the Assembly of First Nations, and the Native Women's Associations of Canada opted for self-led engagement on the policy with support from the government. Let's Go to the next slide. So the consultations themselves are based on the themes of health, environment, food security, and economic growth. And I would say that the wording and objectives for each of these were refined throughout the process, going back a couple times to stakeholders with a revised version as we received additional insights throughout the consultations process. Go to the next slide. We also took a diagnostic of policies that impact or are impacted by food to identify existing investments, gaps, coordination among policies and beneficiaries. This Venn diagram provides a snapshot of some examples of policies across government, but it's not meant to be exhaustive by any means, but just give you a sense of what's there. Go to the next slide. We released a What We Heard report in September 2018, and our Inuit partners and the Native Women's Association of Canada also released reports that you should be able to click on in the PDFs. A really positive outcome from the consultations process was increased engagement and collaboration across the food system. In the case of my department, I've been engaging well beyond the food and agriculture sector. We also saw silos being broken down among food system actors and new relationships were formed, particularly among the cross-cutting themes, which were the establishment of new governance bodies, policy and program coherence, access to improved data, and distinctions-based approaches to Indigenous food systems. There were a number of instances where we saw leaders in industry, civil society, academia, among others, come together to call for action on these and other themes through joint letters and reports to the government. So it was, I would say, a really neat and positive outcome from the consultations beyond the development of policy itself. Go to the next slide. So I'll spend a bit of time here. So in June 2019, the policy was officially launched. Overall, the feedback has been positive in terms of the policy itself. It reflects what was heard during the consultations and achieves a positive balance across interdependent social, health, environmental, and economic outcomes. I've included on the slide the vision, priority outcomes, and guiding principles of the policy as outlined in the policies framework document, which is publicly available. I was asked to provide some reflections in the policy development process, so I'll take some time to do it here now. I would note that many of these are not specific to developing a food policy per se, but I think they're particularly important in successfully advancing a food policy. It was important throughout to employ food systems-based thinking, both in how we develop a policy and how its importance was conveyed to others and how we worked with others. While the policy is a whole of government approach and it was led by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, it was important that we demonstrate that a comprehensive and thoughtful approach was being undertaken that considered diverse perspectives among food system partners and stakeholders, as well as colleagues in other federal departments and agencies. You know, one can imagine that there may be some apprehension that if you have a department responsible for agriculture and agri-food that may be perhaps weighted towards the interests of that sector. So very important that we took a balanced approach in that regard. And so also to consider the complexities and unique characteristics of food systems and thoughtfully consider outcomes and externalities. I think Kuhn kind of brought light to some of those as well, but obviously a fair bit of time went into that. And in terms of achieving that balance and generating support, as noted earlier, the consultations were comprehensive and encouraged leadership from a range of people and organizations. Within the government itself, it was important to showcase how advancing food policy outcomes could also advance the objectives and priorities of individual departments and agencies and their respective mandates. To that point, building relationships and fostering collaboration and fostering connections within government was critical to success. For example, we held an interdepartmental retreat in November 2018, where we brought together a number of federal departments and agencies to discuss the policy development process to date and a plan and path forward, as well as discuss essential components of the policy. We maintained a pretty broad network. We had 17 different departments and agencies, federal departments and agencies that we worked with, and brought them together as we worked to develop the policy and regularly convened groups of departments and agencies on aspects of the policy that were direct relevance to them. So kind of a broader group, and then also on specific areas of interest. Now, this may seem like a lot, but when you start breaking it down into networks and sub-networks, it becomes quite manageable in terms of maintaining those relationships and ensuring that there's a good flow of information in terms of the policy development process. We also maintained a pretty extensive list of drafts, as well as documented responded to input received from other departments and agencies, always going back to the original comments when changes were made and text evolved, as to ensure key areas of importance were not lost in the process, and confirming comfort interdepartmentally with the approach as the policy evolved. We recognized the amazing work of individuals at the working level within, as part of a departmental award that Agriculture and Food Canada does each year. But anything was that we extended that award to a number of individuals and other departments, agencies to recognize the interdepartmental collaboration to launch the policy. Finally, I think these are one of the things that are difficult to for policymakers to kind of bring to life, but we're very fortunate to have champions of the food policy outside of government, from civil society, academia, industry, among others. Certainly senior management within our own department, and at the political level as well. Our minister was definitely a champion of the food policy for Canada and bringing it to life. And so maybe I'll stop there, but just to say there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, and I'll shift my next couple slides towards the implementation. Go to the next slide. Cool. So beyond improved coherence among existing policies and programs that impact or impacted by food, new initiatives were announced to support the implementation of food policy. Among those initiatives, food security and food loss and waste reduction were focused. These were two areas that were identified as requiring increased federal government investments. While not included programs that were later launched as part of the COVID-19 response, I would note that having the food policy for Canada in place, as well as a strong network and relationships both within and beyond government, enabled a response in that regard. So again, quite positive that we had the food policy and had these established relationships in place to not only make progress towards initiatives that were announced as part of the food policy and greater coherence among existing programs and initiatives, but also when it came down to the COVID response. And I think it enabled us to be far more effective and timely in terms of the response. We'll go down to the final slide. So as we continue to implement the policy, engagement collaboration will continue to be a core to our approach, as well as the development of a measurement framework with indicators for the policy that goes beyond program requirements to address broader policy objectives. For example, it's recognized that more data is needed to adequately capture the multiple dimensions of food security and contributing factors in order to better inform policy decisions. We have convened departments and agencies to explore how food security status could be better measured, tracked, and visualized in Canada. Anything we did recently was a data hackathon on food security to get a better sense of available data and how to visualize, along with an approach to continued collaboration across government departments to identify solutions for filling current data gaps. The Food System Summit was mentioned, and what an excellent opportunity for us to further advance implementation of the policy and discuss areas that required increased attention. It included a couple of examples here of member state dialogues that Canada is looking to undertake. We currently have 8 member state dialogues that we're looking to pursue, and there's a series of independent dialogues in Canada as well, which we'll absolutely look to incorporate in terms of our work moving forward. One of those is around a national dialogue on food security data and measurements with stakeholders from various backgrounds. While there's certainly data gaps that need to be addressed, there was consensus that there's a considerable amount of data from various sources, and greater coordination and sharing of data is needed to bring all this information together in a comprehensive way. Food security and measurement frameworks have also been identified as a priority for the recently launched Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council. This is a central component of the food policy, and the council itself reports directly to the Minister of Agriculture and Food. They had the first meetings on March 4th and April 6th. So it brings together a multidisciplinary group that has expertise and lived experience to bring diverse social, environmental, health, and economic perspectives to the table to help address food system challenges and opportunities. Finally, it's important to acknowledge and advance a direct nation-to-nation, government-to-government, and Inuit-to-Crown relationship that aligns with the food policy's guiding principles of reconciliation, which promotes self-determined and distinctions-based approaches to strengthen Indigenous food systems. As an example of this, food policy currently participates in the Inuit-Crown Food Security Working Group under the direction of the Inuit-Crown Partnership Committee. This is one of 3 permanent bilateral mechanisms established to provide distinctions-based approach to priority setting and policy co-development between Canada and Indigenous partners, specifically First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation partners. So maybe I'll take a pause there and end and make sure I give sufficient time to Dustin to go through his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jason. You were perfect, not just before 15 minutes, so that's great. So now I'll introduce our second speaker, Dustin Benton. He's the Chief Analytical Advisor for the UK's National Food Strategy. Dustin is on secondment to DEFRA, having joined from Green Alliance, an independent think tank where he is policy director. His background is in climate and environment policy and politics, with broad expertise across energy, resources, and the natural environment, and a particular focus on getting on track to net zero emissions. Dustin will be presenting on his experiences developing the UK's National Food Strategy. Dustin, you have 15 minutes, and just as a reminder to everyone, you can put questions into the chat and we'll pick them up once we're finished with the presentations.
Thanks very much, Leanne, and thank you all for joining me here. Hopefully my screen should be up there. Please do say if not. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the UK's National Food Strategy. And I think the first thing to say is that we had many of the same challenges that I think Jason alluded to, particularly with the breadth and complexity of the food system. And one way in which we were set up to address that is we were actually set up as an independent review rather than a government-led review. That was to try to get some of that cross-government thinking that is essential to developing a good strategy and to prevent some of the existing thinking from dominating the strategy. But we're independent, but very close to government indeed. Our lead reviewer, Henry Dimbleby, is the lead non-exec director for DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And we're staffed by a hybrid team of insiders and outsiders to government. That was deliberately done to try to stretch the sort of thinking and the options that we fought through. We have a hugely broad remit. I won't read the details, but everything from food safety and health through to animal welfare, nature and climate, of course, affordability and jobs and growth. So it runs the whole gamut of things. And as a result, we have focused very heavily on systems thinking in the way in which we've drawn together our analysis and our recommendations, both because of the complexity and, as Karen mentioned, we're very aware of the many unintended consequences that food policy interventions have made. The low-fat push is associated with an increase in sugar in our diets. Food security-focused subsidies in the past have caused these butter mountains and milk lakes. It's difficult to intervene well without creating unintended consequences, but at least we can think through what the potential implications might be. We have a two-part strategy, and actually we had intended to have a two-part strategy, but COVID sort of got in the way. I'll tell you the detail in a second. Originally, we had hoped to lay out a kind of evidence of what's going wrong with the food system with a vision for what good might look like, and then to come back in part two and say, in effect, how do we get from where we are today to that lovely vision of the future? We had written most of part one by the end of February last year. March came along, we were kind of putting the finishing bells and whistles on that. And I remember over the course of about a week, we went from, ooh, this seems quite serious, to, okay, we're going to pause the food strategy for an indeterminate period of time and give all of our staff back to DEFRA to make sure that we keep food getting to people, whether food insecure people or at a national level. So as a result, we came back very rapidly last summer and rejigged the entirety of part one to really focus on the essential things that seemed absolutely like we couldn't miss out in the context of COVID and, of course, the context of the UK's departure from the European Union. And so we proposed a set of things that focused on obesity. In essence, we proposed a huge change to regulations associated with unhealthy food selling. These will require change to business models for some food companies, and we thought it was justified in its own right, but also in the context of obesity's relationship with COVID mortality risk. We looked at the significant rise in short-term food insecurity that the COVID crisis helped provoke and proposed a big boost to the UK's nutritional safety net. Free school meal expansion, holiday food provision where necessary, and Healthy Start, particularly for pregnant women and young mothers. And that resulted in around £500 million of extra spending to address that really immediate, really unexpected crisis that hit many countries as a result of COVID. And finally, we wanted to touch on trade because it was so salient at that point. So we proposed some things that have bolstered the democratic input into and the transparency of the UK's new trading strategy. The UK is amongst one of the largest food importers in the world, and I think we were last food self-sufficient in somewhere around the mid-1780s. So this is a long-run thing for the UK. We do lots of food trade, and we're now doing it in a different way. And so we wanted to make sure that that was done in a way that was most in keeping with what people want. So part 2 will be out later this year, and there's not very much I can say about the content of that. But I guess the key question for us is, how can we make affordable, healthy, and sustainable food the norm? Today in the UK, you can kind of have 2 of the following 3. You can have healthy and sustainable on the one hand, convenient on the other, and cheap in the third. So I can give you two of those 3, no problem, but getting all 3 is what we want. And we think we can develop a system that does give us all 3. So I'm going to talk briefly about the pretty major problems we have in the food system. These graphs show you the trends in obesity over the past sort of 70 years or so in the UK. And you can see that bell curve, unfortunately, moves to the right towards greater obesity and spreads out. When you look at what's driving some of this, things just jump out at you. So 1 in 4 people in the UK meets the minimum healthy level of fruit and vegetable consumption. 1/3 overconsume red and processed meat, 1/2 overconsume saturated fat, 3/4 overconsume sugar, looking at what the components of a healthy diet might be. And that's not mainly because they don't understand what healthy diets look like. There's something else that's going on. And then looking at another aspect of the problems here, the effect on the natural environment. This graph shows the relative abundance of UK priority species just within the UK. And you can see a long and continuous decline. The British government has a goal of restoring nature. So this trend is obviously in the wrong direction. Unfortunately, the food system is heavily implicated in this. The UK uses 70% of its land to grow food, an area roughly half that again overseas to grow food that British people eat. And that's done sometimes in ways that accidentally cause harms to nature. In the UK, land use change associated with food and fishing is responsible for about 2/3 of the nature loss. Agricultural greenhouse gas emissions haven't fallen materially in the last 12 years. That's despite the UK's really excellent track record on decarbonisation overall. Our hypothesis is that the UK's, not the UK, but the food system itself has been pursuing the wrong goals. And so these harms to nature, the huge rise in obesity, climate change, these are all accidental byproducts of a system that is optimised in sort of the wrong way. And when we thought about how might that have occurred, obviously there's a big, long historic process. But one of the big things that we've landed on quite early on is that food is a 2nd or 3rd order priority for the 16 or so central government departments in England that we've looked at. And this complex picture, which again, I won't talk you through in any great detail, it's before you begin to consider the complexity of the UK's devolved governments. So we have the Scottish government, the Welsh government, and Northern Irish governments that all have their own influences on the food system. People are sort of interested in the outcomes of the effects of the food system, but not really the system itself. And that makes it quite difficult to govern effectively. And finally, we've looked at the kind of what has happened in previous food strategies. These are actually obesity strategies. It's not easy to achieve your goals. That's what we've learned. In essence, most strategies have aimed too low. They've encouraged voluntary, individual change, and that hasn't panned out in a change to the levels of overweightness and obesity, which you can see the lines here, despite its many governments, many different strategies. So this isn't a kind of particular type of problem associated with any one way of viewing the world. We've learned that if you want to shift a big system, you need to think big about big systemic actions, and that's challenging. And of course, complex systems can't be sort of shifted by a single silver bullet. So for us, one of the lessons we've drawn is that you need to institutionalize adaptive change and monitor and evaluate your progress as you make change. This is challenging from a policy perspective. Technically doing this is not straightforward. Doing it in a way that is democratically robust is even more difficult, but let's be honest, it's even harder when you think about what are the politics associated with selling a solution that politicians want to embrace and which they can explain to a voter on a doorstep. These are not easy things to do, but in a sense, that is the challenge that we face. So what actions have we taken in the food strategy? Akin with what you've heard before, we have gone to the people. We know that food strategies failed because they were too timid. They didn't address some of the feedback loops that are causing dietary ill health and the accidental harm to nature. And essentially, if you want robust action, we think we need robust action, you need a robust mandate for change. So we have done a whole bunch of, firstly, we asked people what they were interested in. We got 2,000 very detailed, really thoughtful responses from people. We went out and spoke to ordinary citizens, and I have to say we were very inspired by the Irish Citizens' Assemblies and their relationship with taking ordinary citizens and presenting hugely complex, value-laden problems and kind of working a way through. So we've tried to learn from that in our public dialogues. We've also spoken to experts in great detail. We've had hundreds of hours of interviews with some of the leading experts from across the world. It's been fantastic to speak to people in across the whole world. Certainly, I've spoken to lots of people in the Anglosphere, and we've drawn on evidence from France in particular, where my basic French has proved to be useful enough to decipher some of the expertise there. And of course, we've drawn on all the resources the British government has, talking to lots and lots of different departments to make sure that we're on top of views, evidence, and opinion. We've also gone to the data. And we have felt like we need to be absolutely grounded in the data, both today and as part of our monitoring and evaluation process. We've got pretty good consumption data in the UK, but each one of these has a kind of a little wrinkle associated with it. So on consumption, we know that people are pretty good at recording what they eat through something called the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. But if they actually only ate what they said, they'd all have starved to death because they underreport calories by about 30%. So you've got all these complexities in the data. On nature and carbon, we've got really good evidence on species decline, but huge uncertainty over soils, about how best to restore nature, and massive variance at farm level. So as you delve, you find that some of the data becomes quite challenging. Trade data is very good, quite difficult sometimes for really narrow detail. And economy data is fantastically detailed, but it doesn't always reveal some of the complexities to do with, for example, market power. And thinking about the kind of values, attitudes, and opinions side of things. You can have the data, but how you interpret that is not uncontested. We've commissioned a bunch of research to attempt to unpick some of that, but let's be honest, there are big gaps that are going to remain, and that speaks to the need to not just do a one-off measurement and evaluation exercise. So the final slide from me, and I hope I'm going to shoot in under my 15-minute window here, is how will we know that we've succeeded? Because we're not yet done. And I suspect once we publish, we won't quite be done. The first thing is to say we will propose a set of indicators and metrics to measure action. We have seen how effective the UK's carbon budgets are on climate change. Now, that's something that is uniquely almost subject to putting into numbers, but that's been a really interesting thing to look at. We know we can't measure a complex system of systems just by setting a kind of action and a long-term goal. So we know that food technology is in the midst of a really seriously disruptive set of changes. And, looking at on the kind of far out there kind of end, lab-grown meats, weed zapping robots, gene editing, these are all technologies that are being developed at the moment. We know that social attitudes are hugely age stratified. And so what people want isn't as straightforward as simply taking a poll. What people want, if the over 55s have very different attitudes towards what good food looks like compared to the under 40s. And we know that we have a massive climate and nature crisis, which is going to need regular updating of how we operate and taking into account new attitudes, taking into account new technologies. So that all needs an infrastructure to kind of capture and adapt policy as we go along. And I guess the final thing that we hope as a sign of success is that the way in which we've gone about creating a food strategy, we hope will provide some inspiration for others who want to do this. Earlier in my career, I was involved with the UK's 2050 Pathways Climate Calculator, which was a technical tool designed to facilitate an understanding of the trade-offs and complexities associated with decarbonising. I don't think you can do quite a technocratic exercise with food because so much of it is about culture and love and character and feeling, but perhaps some of the dialogues that we've done, some of the blending of data and the qualitative evidence might prove an inspiration for others. And I'm very keen to answer any questions about that. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dustin. So I can hear a lot of common threads coming in across those presentations. So don't hesitate to get your questions into the chat function. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and move us a little bit more into the data area, because as some of you will know, this is an area of work that my team is moving into. We launched this report on making better policies for food systems, and now we're thinking about data gaps or knowledge gaps in this area. So both of you have talked about the importance of data in a lot of different ways. And I'm curious, I'm going to pose a hypothetical question. So imagine that Bill Gates came in and said, I'll give you $1 million or £1 million to put into gathering data that you need for your food policy. How would you prioritize spending that kind of money? I'm not sure who wants to bounce into that first.
I can jump in on that one.
Okay.
I think the first thing I'd say is, Bill, you know, $1 million isn't that much anymore.
Yes.
But beyond that, I think that one of the things that we're coming to is that we need a system which doesn't just collect data centrally. Loads of players in the food system have fantastic amounts of data. And in a sense, we need to encourage and enable a kind of a data sharing infrastructure that looks a little bit like the internet. It sounds a little bit wild there, but if we could get some of the innovators in the food system to share some of their data with the right intellectual property framework so they were sure that they weren't giving away their commercial secrets, we could begin to perhaps model much more efficiently how might you change the food system, what might the effects of shocks be, and that would be fantastically useful in developing better policy.
Great. Jason, you want to take a stab at spending?
Yeah, I think I'd probably start off similar to Dustin and say that's a nice start. But I think one of the key questions, and perhaps picking up on some of Dustin's comments, is the importance to have a thorough strategy in terms of bringing those various pieces together and recognizing what is already available and exists, as well as shortcomings of the data. When we look around challenges about things like measuring food insecurity among at-risk communities, it can be complex, and it's important to take into account the unique context, the dimensions of food insecurity in that respect. And when we start layering that across other dimensions of food systems, you could end up with a pretty comprehensive framework. So I think it's important to find a way to be able to visualize that in a way that people can easily understand, but it's layered with a series of intermediary and kind of indicators supporting that broader framework. And certainly a priority area. It's something that kind of keeps our team up at night. And I think it's been identified across a broad range of stakeholders.
Then I'll bounce it over to Dustin again.
Yeah, great question. So we certainly have the healthy eating strategy in Canada, and that is to make the healthier choice the easier choice for all Canadians. We also have Canada's food guide, and these were essential components of advancing the food policy, particularly the priority outcome of improved health-related outcomes associated with food for Canadians. And so I think there's opportunities there to further expand upon the healthy eating strategy, to work with the sector to identify opportunities to improve availability of healthy food products for Canadians. For example, whether it be like program investments. There's a really neat one, and just to explain very briefly, was the partially dehydrating and flash freezing of fruits and vegetables, which better maintain their nutrient qualities and enable access to Canadian fruits and vegetables throughout the year, particularly in the cold winter months in Canada. So you can see a number of benefits that could be derived from these types of approaches. So continuing those efforts to expand upon healthy eating while supporting the implementation of the healthy eating strategy.
Thanks. Dustin?
I think I'd echo the importance there. When we think about the kind of challenges that arise from the food system, health comes to the top of the list, certainly for the things that we can monetize. The costs of ill health in the UK are rising continuously. And when you think about how that's expressed, well, I mean, obviously the human experience is pretty bad, but it's also a kind of clear thing that shows up on the balance books for the UK government. We have a national healthcare system. So there's a lot of interest in how might we improve food consumption such that the negative effects don't end up costing so much. I think the other thing to say is that there is a real, there's a really positive relationship between many of the health goals that we have and the sustainability goals. Very often, not always, but very often the things that you would eat for a healthy set of outcomes are also the things that give you a lower carbon, more nature-rich diet. So there are some real positives to take from drawing that health, nature, and climate piece together.
Great, thank you. And this kind of leads me into another question, because both of you commented on the importance of collaboration across departments within the government. And what you were just commenting on, which is sort of coherence around objectives. I wonder if you guys would be willing to reflect on what aspects of this coordination and collaboration challenge were surprising to you, either in a positive or negative way.
I always like to focus on the positive. And so I'll start there. I think just the networks that were established throughout the development of the policy, and that's kind of were strengthened from kind of pre-existing networks, was highly advantageous in not only advancing kind of food policy, but also looking for opportunities to advance the mandates of other departments and agencies as well, and being able to show increased efficacy among policies when they kind of work together and they consider interdependent social, health, environmental, and economic outcomes. I think Dustin commented quite eloquently in terms of the costs associated to diet-related disease, and both in terms of the human costs and also from an economic-based perspective. And so, being able to bring those elements together to demonstrate like a really positive case for change among departments and agencies, and having that, I think, is far more effective than kind of an individual department or agency trying to go it alone.
Justin, can I just ask a follow-up question? Because you also mentioned in your presentation about the reconciliation as a guiding principle. And I wondered a little bit if there was also an angle around coordination and collaboration with the Indigenous people.
So that the Indigenous people one is a little bit difficult to speak about from a UK perspective. I might let Jason pick up on that one. In terms of the kind of coordination and collaboration, I think the starting point is that actually we aren't terribly well coordinated, and that's because it's this sort of second or third order priority. And in a way, I think the lessons that we've drawn so far is you kind of have to step back from a policy problem and say, okay, so we kind of understand where everyone's driven from, whether it's your targets or your kind of goals within your team or whatever, as a group of civil servants speaking, and to think, okay, how might we get out of that paradigm that we bring and think about how we address this problem from a more in the round perspective. In a sense, that's why we were set up as an independent review outside of government, to just attempt to do that. The real challenge will be in institutionalizing that in the long run, because it's easy to carve something out and say, right, you've got a task, run with it for a little while and come up with things. But we know that governments exist and are cut up for a good reason, and actually that's quite efficient often to just pick up a part of the problem. So making sure that we can return to that, okay, let's step back, think, and then act. That's, I think, the big challenge for food policy particularly.
Great. So maybe I bounce back to Jason if you had any comment on the Indigenous people side of this question.
In the context of reconciliation, I think it's important to recognize kind of historical context and the role of food in those contexts. And also to recognize that Indigenous food systems in Canada typically consist of, and it varies among communities, of course, but importer market foods, local agricultural production, and the harvesting of traditional country foods. And oftentimes too, I think those who are not within the communities themselves are not well positioned in order to be able to bring forward solutions that would best represent the aspirations of the community itself, and oftentimes, don't have a full understanding of, for example, the importance of the traditional harvesting of country foods to the community and what that means to not only from an access to perspective, but in terms of the centrality of the traditional harvesting and what it means to community members. And so, like it's an appreciation that communities themselves and Indigenous peoples are best placed in order to determine their respective food systems, and it's important to do so in a manner that reflects Inuit, First Nations, and our Métis Nation partners' interests.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions that have popped in, and we're getting to the end of the hour, so I'll tell you what they are, and then you can decide which one you'd like to address. So the first one is quite practical, and this has to do with thinking about actually handling the information. So the question is, how should a public administration design a filing system to handle all the food systems information? I guess this also goes with the cross-cutting, cross silos. And the second question relates to digitalization. So could the digitalization of the agriculture solve some of data issues if the data ownership is resolved? So the second one, I think Dustin had a comment a little bit about intellectual property. I don't know if that one is one you'd like to respond to.
Sure. So I can't really speak to the right filing system. This is quite complex, and I think I would just draw out the fantastic amount of information processing and management stuff that has been done in digital technologies to point in that direction. On the kind of measuring thing, we clearly need much better, much more automated remote sensing, particularly for anything to do with nature and climate, stuff that's happening on a farmer's field. You actually have to go there and talk to the farmer. It's a massive faff. It's very expensive to do as well. And insofar as we can get that information in an automated way, that's absolutely the right way. The other thing to pay attention to, though, is that lots of farmers already are doing a huge amount of measurement because it's in their self-interest. What they're not doing is sharing that data more broadly. And that's because sometimes they don't want, the farmer next door to figure out why their milk yields are higher than their neighbors for perfectly good, perfectly reasonable kind of competitive advantage reasons. But there is value, public value, that's locked up in that. And so in a sense, the challenge is, what is the intellectual property framework and what are the confidentiality agreements and data security protocols that are required to enable that farmer to feel confident that if he or she shares the process that they're doing or some of the outcomes so that the public can get some sense of what's going right and how we replicate that, but they're not going to lose out on the competitive pressure. Similarly, retailers, and we saw this during COVID, have fantastic amounts of information about precisely where food is in the supply chain. The UK has a just-in-time supply chain. We are heavily dependent, particularly for fresh food, on flows, particularly across the channel. And having done that, I've seen just how precise that data is, but it's not usually available to public policymakers. The context of the crisis enabled some of that to open up, but getting a slightly better sense of that in normal times would be fantastically useful.
Great, thank you. Jason, any comments on those two questions?
I think having an epic database is needed in order to keep track of all these things. And maybe just picking on Dustin's comments too, like importance of taking life cycle based analyses in terms of measuring whether it be the environmental implications of agricultural production and also considering like circularity of economies as well and the interrelationships among the supply chain. It's not a straightforward thing to do. One of the cool things that we've been advancing recently is around geospatial mapping, which I think shows a great deal of promise as well.
Great, thank you so much. So we're wrapping up. And in a minute, I'll turn to Jason and Dustin to give us their last 1-minute remarks. But just as a reminder, this is the third of a series of webinars that we've been calling how-to webinars on food systems. And the first one was about deliberative processes, how deliberative processes can make better policies for food systems. And the second one had to do with regulatory impact assessments. We put the links to both of the recording of those webinars into the chat if you're interested. So now I'll turn back to our speakers for a last word. Dustin, over to you.
Sure. So how to summarize a food system in a minute or less? My goodness. I guess I will aim for 4 things. The first is you have to be bold. What we've learned from speaking to people who've been involved in this before is that you're far more likely to fail by aiming too low than by not understanding the data or all that kind of stuff. The second is try to be quantitative. Economics, health, nature, climate, all of those things can be really well quantified, and it's very easy to fail if you don't set measurable goals. Even if you then end up failing, at least you understand how much and why. So being quantitative where you can is really important. But at the same time, the food system is not a kind of just a database problem which has metrics that are quantified. Food is culture, food is love, food is character, food is countryside. And that aspect of things requires a continuous interaction with people who are the only way that you will learn about that. So you've got to check back in with people all the time about how you go. And I guess that's my final one. The public dialogues we did were absolutely essential, cutting through the noise, grounding our recommendations. And I have to say, I have been surprised that often normal people just off the street are much bolder and more interesting than some of the experts we've spoken to.
Great, and more interesting. Okay, Jason, over to you.
Thanks, and that's a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. I'll say a whole government approach is absolutely needed in that respect, and just picking your comments in terms of thoughtful dialogue that brings together diverse stakeholders and partners from across the food system and really explores kind of externalities that may exist and unattended both positive and negative outcomes of potential approaches. And having people kind of at the grassroots phase in terms of working to develop the policies, I think you're far more likely to have improved success when it comes to the implementation stage as well. I mentioned this as well previously, but focus on the positive. There are a number of challenges that exist when it comes to food systems, particularly in Canada. But I find being able to kind of pull those pockets where success has been achieved to advance interdependent social, health, environmental, and economic outcomes, and to then look at the art of the possible and how those could potentially be scaled up is something that I would encourage people to do in that regard.
Well, that's a great closing remark, the art of the possible. So I'd like to close on that note. Thank you all for joining us for the webinar, and please join me with giving our speakers a round of applause virtually. And I'm wishing you all a great day. Bye.